For record-keeping purposes, if you wish to make a statement regarding any item on the agenda, please complete the form located at the entrance or at the rear of the council chambers and deposit it with the Planning and Housing Commission Secretary. Good evening and welcome to tonight's Planning and Housing Commission meeting. Commissioner Alexander will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Communications from the public. Persons wishing to address the Planning and Housing Commission are requested to state their name for the record. This portion of the agenda is intended for public comment. State law prohibits the Planning and Housing Commission from discussing or taking action on items not listed on the agenda. The Planning and Housing Commission will appreciate your cooperation in keeping your comments brief. Please observe a 3-minute limit to communications. Ms. Capilla, did we receive any speaker cards or written comments from the public for any items not on tonight's agenda?
Chair Sikwalan, no, we did not receive any speaker cards or written comments.
Thank you. The election of the chair and vice chair will be continued to a future meeting. Item number 1 is meeting minutes, approval of minutes for the Planning and Housing Commission meeting of January 23, 2023. Ms. Capilla, did we receive any speaker cards or written comments from the public regarding the January 23rd meeting minutes?
No, Chair, we did not.
And do we have a motion for approval for those minutes?
I make a motion to approve the minutes.
And I second.
And we have a second by Commissioner Alexander. Please vote. Meeting minutes pass. We have 3 items for public hearing on tonight's agenda that staff has recommended for approval. Those are items 3, 4, and 5. I'm going to move those up on the agenda, and we'll work through those and the recommendation and proceed with motion. So that first item is item number 3. It's a public hearing item number GPA 2022-004. It's a request to change the general plan land use designation of a .86 acre parcel located on the east side of Promenade Avenue and approximately 170 feet north of 6th Street from the general commercial GC to the light industrial LI zone. The applicant on that item was Netzer Admati and Johnny Greer. This item, as stated, has been recommended that we continue to our next meeting of February 21st, 2023. As such, do we have a motion from the commission to continue that item?
I make a motion to continue.
And I second.
And we have a second by Commissioner Alexander. If we'd please vote on that item number 3. And that motion to continue is approved. Next item is number 4. It's a public hearing item CZ 2022-004, a request to change the zone of a .86 acre parcel located on the east side of Promenade Avenue and approximately 170 feet north of 6th Street from a C3 general commercial to an M1 light manufacturing. The applicant again is Netzer Admati and Johnny Greer. Recommendation on staff is to continue this item until our next meeting of February 21st, 2023. Do we have a motion for continuance?
I make a motion to continue.
And I second.
And we have a second by Commissioner Alexander. Could vote on that item, please. And the motion continue passes. Item number 5 is a public hearing item, is for CUP 2021-0004, a conditional use permit application to allow a drive-through and walk-up window coffee shop, Starbucks, within an existing commercial center located at the southeast corner of Green River Road and Dominguez Ranch Road in the neighborhood commercial district of the Sierra del Oro specific plan. The applicant was Jessica Steiner of Bicker Architectural. This item has been recommended by staff to continue to our February 21st meeting. Do I have a motion for that continuance?
I make a motion to continue.
I'll second.
And we have a second by Commissioner Alexander. Please vote. And the motion to continue passes. All right. Thank you for moving through that. We'll return to our first public item notice. Number 2 is a public hearing. This is item that was continued from our January 23rd meeting. It is for the consideration of a high-density residential and mixed-use objective development standards and design guidelines. The applicant is the City of Corona. Ms. Joanne Coletta, the Director of Planning and Development, will present this item. Ms. Coletta, welcome.
Thank you and good evening. And as you indicated, this is a continued public hearing from the meeting that we had 2 weeks ago on the housing element rezoning program. It's been a long process, but you have been patient and getting a lot of education along the way. So what I want to do real quickly is just give you a quick recap of what has transpired to date. As you recall, at the last meeting, we did our housing element rezoning program. And what that program did is it really established residential zoning at a higher density to accommodate certain densities on various properties throughout the city. And that was really to meet the city's regional housing need within its housing element, which the commission reviewed last year. The regional housing need that was issued to the City of Corona was just over 6,000 units, and approximately 2,800 of those units was designated for low-income housing. Therefore, the rezoning program really focuses on making accommodations for the low-income housing unit allocation and not so much for any other unit allocation. So on January 23rd, we had a public hearing. It was a rather long public hearing, so we were here for some time. And at that time, the commission did approve various applications related to the rezoning program. And those applications that included the general plan amendment, the change of zone, the specific plan amendment, the zone text amendment, and the CFPA were all recommended to City Council. However, there was one item within that rezoning program that was continued to this evening, and that was the high-density residential and mixed-use objective development standards and design guidelines. The commission just wanted a little bit more time to review that, given a lot of the voluminous information that they were provided for the previous meeting. So as I indicated, the rezoning program is really focusing on that high density designation. When we did our housing element and we did our sites inventory, it was made very clear at that time that we did not have enough zoning in the city to accommodate the high density, which then accommodates that affordable housing component for low-income housing units. So we really needed to do that sites inventory, identify which sites that we can basically upzone and increase the density. So the rezoning program really supports higher density in an urban setting. It will allow for residential and commercial mixed-use development. It also supports the planning of low-income housing units. And it also provides housing opportunity within proximity to public transportation and commercial services. And if you recall from the last meeting, the majority of those sites were mostly centered along our 6th Street corridor and North Main Street corridor, because that's where you have the public transportation as well as the commercial services, and where you can really push that urban density to still have it be compatible with some surrounding environments. So what I want to do is just get into the development standards that we were not able to talk about last week. But first, I just want to hit on the schedule. It just gives you an overview of where we started on the development standard program. We started that kickoff back in April of 2021. We brought on Stantec Consulting, and they were helping us through this process. And so the document that you see today is in collaboration with Stantec. We did have some initial meetings with the Planning Commission, as you know, back in June of 2022. And then at that time, some draft development standards were being put forward. We then came back and had an additional meeting in August to talk about some of the research that we have done. At that time, we also did some stakeholder meetings that were in person as well as by Zoom, with some of the stakeholders being people that actually develop affordable housing projects. So we wanted to hear from them on, when it comes into cities and you're looking to develop, what are the constraints? Because the whole process of this is really to eliminate constraints. So we wanted to hear from them on what they experience in other cities and what actually would make them want to come in and build affordable housing in the city. The draft design guidelines were then completed in September. Staff reviewed those. The final design guidelines were completed in October, and then we posted those on our website in November. So we made them available to the public so anybody can have a preview of what the design guidelines and development standards look like. And as you see there, we were here 2 weeks ago doing the rezoning program, and we're here again tonight. And the intent is to get set to go to the City Council on March 1st for the entire rezoning program. So because the city did not have enough zoning to accommodate the high density need, the law now says that in order for us to basically, let me restate that. What the law says, because we had to do so much rezoning to accommodate higher density for affordable housing, that process now needs to be done as by right. And that means that there's no longer any discretionary review. But there are still standards that the project needs to be held to, and those are what we call objective development standards. It means like whatever the city adopts, similar to what we have today at zoning, the project needs to comply with that. It just cannot be, a project cannot be denied or considered based on a subjective standard. It has to be objective. So we have to be looking at what we've adopted and we have to apply it to the project. And that's just because it's fairness. That's what it's all about. You're treating all projects the same because you're relying on that objective standard. As part of that process, we will be still doing our development plan review. That is a process the city has had for many years. And it's actually a pre-application process for all new construction. It comes into the city. City staff sits down with the developer. We evaluate their proposal and we make sure it meets all of the criteria of adopted ordinances as well as rules and regulations. And they have to do this before they submit any kind of application to the city for a permit related to building plans or grading plans, and in some cases, anything related to discretionary applications such as CUPs and tentative tract maps. They all go through this DPR process. That will still be in place with this program. The law does not eliminate a pre-application process. It still allows us to do that. So all these new projects will still go through a thorough development plan review. So back when we met with the Planning Commission through those study sessions, we did look at comparison of other cities. We did look at the city of Anaheim, Riverside, as well as Rancho Cucamonga. And then we also looked at our own development standards that we already had in place along North Main Street. North Main Street was the pilot program for the city of Corona when it came to urban density development. So we already had development standards in our backyard that we can reference. So we were looking at these comparisons when it comes to drafting these new development standards for our affordable housing overlay zone. So what I want to do tonight is just go over those development standards and then, have any questions from the committee commission that we could talk about. But what's happening here is the density with the affordable housing overlay zone that was previously approved. The density is anywhere from 45 to 60 dwelling units to the acre. So that is consistent with what you see in some of the other jurisdictions and what you also see along North Main Street. And that is simply because you want to make sure that there is enough density there to accommodate low-income housing units, which can be part of a mixed-income project with market rate units. The floor area ratio is either 2.0 or it's per the general plan designation. The minimum unit size, in talking with some of the stakeholders through that process and with affordable housing builders, they said their preference is to have really no minimum unit size. They like that flexibility as to what they can bring to the table. But in all case, they said 400 square feet was fair for them to start with studio and one bedroom. So we took that into consideration. And then a minimum unit size of 550 square feet would be for any market rate. So those are the minimums. It does not prevent them from being larger. So they can go up to 650 or 700 square feet, depending upon the bedroom count. And then the height limit was 60 feet for an all residential project, and then going up to 80 feet if it's a mixed use project where you would have commercial on the ground floor and residential on the upper floors. And that's likely to accommodate podium parking designs for the parking that would be needed for both uses. And as you can see there in looking at some of the comparison cities, they have a height of 100 feet. In North Main, under the mixed use, we have no height limitation. We simply rely on the FAR. And then with the urban density, we limit it to 60 feet. So when it comes to the minimum building setbacks, it does vary in all of the comparable cities. Some of them don't have a setback, but however, they may specify that a certain street has to have a setback. For whatever reasons that jurisdiction did. So in our case, the minimum street setback from the front property line would be 5 feet for residential. However, we would like 8 feet for commercial. And that's really to accommodate any space in front of the commercial storefront, whether it be for seating, if it's a restaurant use, if it's mixed use, that they are able to accommodate any outside seating or any types of display that they want to have without actually encroaching into the sidewalk. So that's where we came up with those development standards. I can tell you that the downtown specific plan that we currently have in place for our downtown area, it's an 8-foot setback for commercial properties today. So that was actually rather consistent in mixed use to have that 8-foot setback if you have commercial on the ground floor. The interior would be an 8-foot setback, as well as the rear would be 5 feet. The development standards do take into consideration adjacent to single family. A setback criteria there where it would be 8 feet for a 1-story element, and then anything 2 stories and above would be 15. However, I do want to let you know, based on our current inventory for the affordable housing overlay zone, we do not abut any single family residential zones. So they are abutting other commercial properties and R3 properties, which are multifamily residential. And then there is no requirement with respect to lot coverage. We're solely going to rely on that floor area ratio. When it comes to the on-site landscaping, the proposed standards are talking about 100 square feet per unit, and it's a 50-50 split. 50% of the allocation would need to be in private open space, which are balconies, and then 50% in common open space. So that's area where all of the tenants have a common area to gather, and that could be like in pools or recreations and so forth. So there's a 50-50 split in that. When it comes to the parking space per unit, it simply goes back to our Corona Municipal Code. And then any affordable housing is subject to the California Government Code. However, I do want to bring to the Commission's attention, there was a bill that was passed in September. It was AB 2097. And that bill really stated, well, it basically says that any property that is zoned for residential, commercial, and office that is within a half mile of public transit doesn't need to have a minimum parking requirement. So we are currently dealing with that as a city to see what qualifies as public transportation within the timelines that are specified in the government code. So that is something that we are continuing to have to evaluate. But again, this was legislation that came down from the state and was approved by the governor. So it's just another example of really trying to move some of these barriers that the state feels has been, precluding housing to a certain degree. So this diagram here shows you what the coverage would look like on a lot, really the basic density at the lower end of the 45 dwelling units per acre. And then at the highest end, this shows you the coverage of 60 dwelling units to the acre. Very similar to what you see on North Main Street today. Stantec also provided you some other examples of what that massing may look like. So it just gives you that general idea right there. I do want to go into the design guidelines and talk about that a little bit. And design guidelines really deal more with the cosmetic nature of what the buildings look like, as well as the site design, which are all very important, and it's things that this commission looks at with other projects. So some of the ones we're going to highlight today, you know, you had the whole package in your packet this evening, but we're going to talk about the building form and articulation. We're going to hit on parking. We're going to talk about site circulation, sidewalk, cycling and transit, as well as open space and amenities. So when you talk about building form and articulation, similar to other guidelines that we already have adopted in the city, mostly in specific plans, we talk about, you know, making sure that the facade of the building is well articulated with accents, there's building recesses. You really just don't want a real straight monolithic looking building. You do want it to have some depth to it, and you do want it to be attractive. So that's what the guidelines call for. It actually talks for depressions so many feet, as well as changes in the reveal style, and maybe having the ground floor units look different than the upper floor units. Another thing that we are recommending adoption of is that the Western Riverside Council of Governments also put out their own objective development standards for all of the WRCOG cities to use. And they really hit on a lot of architectural styles that are used here in Riverside County. So we are actually picking up the Spanish, Revival, Craftsman, Tuscan, and Modern examples that WRCOG has put forth, because those are all examples that have been used here in the city, and it fits well with the city. So in some of the examples, you may see some really tall glass buildings. That's nothing that these architectural styles would promote. So we're still trying to maintain the harmony with the style that we have already put in place in the city. And that was included as part of your package as well, to give you an idea of what that architecture looks like. When it comes to parking, the parking should be located to the rear of the building. You really don't want that to be the first thing you see from the street. So if it's a parking structure, the idea is to have a wraparound structure or integrated as part of the building located to the rear. Surface parking should also be put to the rear, but it also should be well buffered with landscaping. And that's what these design guidelines call for. So when staff is looking at these projects, they still have to go down this list and say, does it meet all of this criteria? This information is also available to architects, so they should be reading into this as well and designing projects to meet this guideline. Site circulation and access was another one. We definitely want access in the building to be noticeable, and we also want it to be safe. So we want to make sure that there is adequate lighting within those pathways. And we also want to make sure that access is easy to get to, even providing curb cutouts along the street. So if you have people doing deliveries or Uber pickups, if at all possible, if working with our engineering team, if they have the ability to do cutouts so you can still allow traffic to move through on the street, that would be recommended. Cycling and transit, since all of these are located within our area of public transportation, making sure bike racks are available on the site itself. That is a California Green Code, but making sure we're making accommodation for alternative modes of transportation. And then the sidewalk in the public realm, this is really important. It's, again, if you look at the picture on the bottom left there, you have a building that is probably set maybe 5 feet back before it hits the public sidewalk. That is the intent there. So you still have an urban density feel, but you're still providing enough space to make accommodations for seating or walkability within that environment. So it's basically using what you can along that street front, very typical of downtown neighborhoods. And then the open space and common amenities, given that you have to really go high on the density, and given that there is limitation on the availability of land, you're starting to have to get creative on where you can do common open space areas. Rooftop amenities have become very popular in urbanized cities. The North Main Street project also used a rooftop amenity. So it doesn't necessarily need to be at the surface level. It can actually be used in other areas. So there are requirements that an architect would need to look at and where they're going to provide that space and what would be accepted and how much square feet they would need to be provided. So really the recommended action is that the Planning Commission recommend to the City Council moving these design guidelines forward. But for the time being right now, myself, as well as Stantec, who is on Zoom tonight, is available for questions and any comments you may have.
Wow, thank you, Ms. Coletta, and I'm glad we did continue this item because there's a lot of data there, and there would have been a lot of data on top of a long evening at our last meeting. So before we move to public comment, questions from commission to staff, and also Mr. Maletsky from Stantec, who's also on with Zoom. Alexander, do you want to start?
Sure, thank you, Chair. Ms. Coletta, regarding the staff report where you talk about the cities that were chosen, what other cities were considered, or were those the only ones that their zoning aligned with ours?
So those are the ones that Stantec research with the TOD standards. Those are the ones that stood out. The local one here would definitely be the city of Riverside, which is our neighbor.
Thank you. I had questions regarding, we got lots of notes.
Yeah.
Excuse me just a minute, please. So going back to your slide show, could you go back to, regarding the timeline that you had, and you had meetings with the, or maybe it was Stantec that had the meetings with the stakeholders. Could you expand a little bit about what the developers talked about regarding what impediments there might be or what obstacles they run into when they approach not just Corona, but any city as far as affordable builds?
Yeah, the stakeholder meeting that we had was very positive, but Adam's on the line. He has actually done this several times with other jurisdictions as well, and he's currently working on a TOD for Riverside County area. Adam, can you elaborate a little bit on what you've heard just throughout in general from those stakeholders on building affordable housing?
Yes. Good evening, Commissioners. This is Adam Maletsky with Stantec. And to answer your question, there are several factors and it kind of depends on, the local setting and, issues with traffic. But certainly parking is certainly a constraint when it comes to multifamily housing. Achieving the right balance of parking that's provided for residents, for guest parking, but also, the reality that it costs upwards of $40,000 a stall to do structured parking. So a lot of affordable housing projects that have, 10 plus sources of funding, which is difficult to juggle, have to raise, millions of dollars, for additional parking demand. And so, we understand that's been an ongoing conversation within the city. So the design standards actually revert back to the Corona Municipal Code, and that, will allow some flexibility to address, future parking standards as needed. Another barrier with affordable housing is just certainly in this economy, finding construction crews, finding contractors who can actually source and build projects like this can be difficult to do. And another thing that we try to address through the guidelines is really creating some flexibility. So being clear about what the goal is, the overall goal when it comes to ground floor articulation, building setbacks, but really allowing the architect and the applicant to be creative and kind of implementing the goals that the city has set forth. So we've tried to be very clear, general enough to allow for some flexibility, but specific enough per SB 35, the objective development standards, to ensure that it's a building that is integrated within the community and really achieves the design goals that the city has set forth.
Thank
Does
you.
that answer your question, or?
I do have some follow-up. So you're talking about the cost of parking being $40,000 a stall. So if affordable unit comes forward and 20% of it is affordable units, what is the majority of the complex? What do you do with the parking if there is no parking ratio? Or you said it does fall back to the CMC?
Yeah, I should clarify, for affordable units, we are referring to the standards in the California Government Code, Section 65915-P1, and those apply to specifically to affordable housing. But market rate units, as I said, that'll defer to the Corona Municipal Code.
Okay, so the only savings on parking, for example, would be addressed to those 20%?
Yes. Yes, the affordable housing component has always had legislation in place where their parking standard is more lenient.
I see. So, for example, if a developer comes forward in your discussions with them at the stakeholder meetings, if they were to come forward and do an affordable project with 20% of them not having any parking ratio, but the other 80% do. So that's the minimum standard you have for that project that is processed through staff. And the rest of it, those that are market rate, would just have, if there was an overflow, I'm trying to imagine where the parking's going to go if you don't have enough spaces.
Yeah, it's not a good scenario, and the passage of that assembly bill, it's not a good scenario. So I would hope that a developer, knowing that they want to make accommodations for their clients and their customers, people are going to want to have a parking space. Nobody wants to leave their car on the street or have to park it somewhere else. So it's going to be interesting to see how that assembly bill is going to get vetted out with an actual project. We have not had one yet. Definitely the peak hour travel times for public transportation is the crucial decider on how many trips it is during that peak period and whether or not a project would qualify. But that's something that, yes, that's something we definitely have a concern over. And there's nothing in the law that they clearly say that the developer cannot volunteer additional parking requirements. But the hope is that to make it even palatable and enticing for people to want to live there is that you have parking available.
I agree. And not only that, but your project goes in, and the main thing that over the years that we've talked about is being self-sufficient on site and not having that overflow and being good neighbors for the lots next door to them. You spoke about the economy that the stakeholders spoke of during this economy and having a hard time. Is that for return on investment, or is that for financing such a project because there's so much competition for that financing? Or how? Could you expand on that, please? Mr. Stan.
That's you, Adam.
Sorry, Adam.
Hi. Sorry about that. So yeah, it's it often is with affordable housing projects. You have several sources of funding. Could be cap and trade. It could be the low-income housing tax credit program. Foundation support, and some private equity. And so because of that, developers have to juggle the different cycles of funding programs. So it can take, upwards of 3 to 5 years in order to realize a significant affordable housing project. As you may have heard, at least in the city of Los Angeles, the cost of housing is upwards of $600,000 a door. And that's just all in. That's just the cost. And that's for market rate housing. The costs are similar for affordable housing. So that's fixed. And then, it's that lead up, that pre-development phase, the pulling together sources of funding, gaining approvals through a discretionary process. that the state has really been trying to address and helping to remove some of those barriers that are really in the way of producing affordable housing, streamlining kind of the entitlement process, which is SB 35, which is going to would allow affordable units by right subject to these development standards.
So in your discussions with the developers, having the city move forward and have it go to council here in March and then move forward from that, they're going to be chomping at the bits to build?
I wouldn't say, I do think funding is a critical factor. What is not understood, and like Adam has indicated, to build a market rate unit is the same cost to build an affordable housing unit. The cost isn't different. The cost of construction is absolutely the same. The labor cost is the same. With the funding cycles, these are competitive funding cycles. So when somebody goes for a tax credit, the TCAC, it's competitive. You're competitive with the entire region. And I believe a couple of years ago, that region included San Bernardino County. So it even makes it more competitive for those that are in Riverside County. And there is a scoring criteria. So these affordable housing builders, they actually have a finance person that is specifically put on this to determine where do they think they're going to rank in a funding cycle. And if they don't get it in the first round, as Anna indicated, then they got to wait for the next round. And hopefully they're inching up, or are they going to inch back down on that rating? So it's highly competitive. And that's been a lot of the conversation that we have said in our lobbying, saying, look, the state wants all of this housing, but yet where's the funding mechanism? So, the governor's budget is putting more into these grant proposals and hopefully these fundings to make affordable housing more enticing. But I don't think you're going to have a windfall. Construction cost is construction cost. Land availability is limited. So I think what we've seen in terms of our pace, it's going to continue to likely be that pace. But it's a big question. It's a big question.
I was just trying to understand, okay, now that it moves forward, what as a city can we anticipate at what rate to move forward? So there's nothing around the corner that...
No, I think it's the economies of scale, absolutely, like an everyday business. It's no different than how we gauge, our industry is cyclical. It goes with the cycle. So when the market's high and things are moving good, it's great. You got supply chain issues now. So you have a lot of people that are building out there, but they can't finish a job because, they can't get certain parts back in, to complete the job. There's a lot of that. So timing of construction's become critical. Mm-hmm.
And I guess regarding what Adam was talking about for the economy, so if they're not making money on their project, I wouldn't want to see them to put forward a project that would cut back on articulation or the facades and the complexity of the look that we've come to enjoy in the city for our projects, especially Main Street. And so that would be a concern on my part. I'll go ahead and hold off on my others.
You have a lot too, yeah. You mind if I go? I had lots of questions, and I'm keeping track of those that have been asked. I'm just going to go in an order that I had. On slide 6 of your presentation, Ms. Collette, I had some questions about the process. So we know that SB 35 requires by right that once these plans are in place, a developer can build to those without really much question or change to their application.
Well, I just want to make it clear. It's still objective and it's still subject to staff's scrutiny. So remember, when the projects are brought here to you, they have undergone that whole evaluation with staff. And you've seen in the background sometimes the timeline of some of these projects. So staff in itself does a really good job of making sure it's meeting whatever the objective standard is.
Sure, good. Yeah, that's where I'm going with this. So that section 2 of it, where it does not comply with or does comply with standards. In the staff report, there's a statement that says the objective development standards and design guidelines were created within compliance with state law, which limits the city's review of housing developments to objective standards that involve no personal or subjective judgment by a public official. And So I understand there's the process. We still have a development standard that we've already had in place. It's being recommended for change based upon the guidelines presented to us. And you also provided several checklists, very detailed checklists that go through every aspect of this. What is the setback? What is the parking ratio? What is the FAR? I mean, I think I counted well over 150 boxes that get checked off. So my question is, if it's not subjective, is this empirical? Does every box in the process need to be checked yes? And if it is, then it's automatically approved to the standard? Or is it a percentage checked yes? Or one section weighted greater than the other? Is this all or nothing? Or I'd like you to kind of explain that process. So of these 197 yeses, do they all have to be yes in order for the process to move without any further administrative review?
Yeah, so that checklist actually is duplicative. It's repetitive of what the objective standards are. So it's basically there to be a guide sheet for the planner to go, okay, they're doing this, yes. If they don't, then the planner can raise to the developer, hey, you're not meeting this criteria. When I did the plan review, in development plan review, you're not able to meet this criteria. Therefore, we're able to provide a list to the developer to show them where the shortfall is, where they're not meeting the criteria. If a project needs a variance because it can't meet an objective standard, it has to come back to you. Those kind of decisions have not been waived. Those continue to happen at a discretionary level. So really the intent of this document is to say, here's everything you need to know from step 1 to step 10, and then they follow that. So they have an idea of what they are required to do. If it's not compliant and they need some deviation or some other sort of an amendment, it's got to come back to this commission.
Okay, great. You answered one of my questions. So if there is a single item that cannot be satisfied on the list, then that developer is posed with, I either make a correction and comply with the standard, or I apply for a variance and go through the entire review process that we currently have in place. Okay, thank you. So in keeping with that, I noticed in the documentation that the city attorney actually certifies the application. What's the exact language? That the city attorney verifies and ultimately certifies that the application meets the criteria. Is that, has that always been in place, or is that new to the standards?
No, and I'm wondering if that is in reference to the 20% low income criteria, because they are going to have to record a deed restriction.
Okay.
Normally, your developments that are not brought to you by our housing authority, there is no tie to some kind of covenant. In this particular case, they do need to do a covenant, and that is in the ordinance that was recommended for approval 2 weeks ago. So that process needs to be looked at by the city attorney to make sure that it's compliant, absolutely.
All right, and only in that situation of the 20%?
Yes, yes.
Understood. So it's not all reviews, it's just when there is a
Yes.
portion. Okay, thank you. You made a comment earlier, I thought it was interesting, that with the approvals of, under the AHO, our current zones do not abut any single housing units?
Yeah, so I looked at that to make sure. So it abuts additional C3s and R3 zoning. So there is already that transition that took place many years ago in the planning of 6th Street. When you had commercial, they had R3 zoning adjacent to those properties already. And then the properties that were removed by this commission off of Pleasant View, those were the only single families. So those have now since been taken off, and those are reflected in the new update going to the city council. So all of that was taken out.
Thank you. You follow my train of thought in that we know that you're going to be coming back to us with new recommended locations since we reduced from
Yes.
our approval. So it would behoove us to also ensure that we're not abutting single-family homes so that we're consistent with all of the zones that we do have approved, I would think.
Yes.
And that was a good question, because I had the same thing in the footprint on that page on the slide, and I was looking at the annotations for the back and the side yard for 8 and 15 feet, and thought, my gosh, if there's a house right there and you've got a multi-story.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You also mentioned the AB 2097, which I remember reviewing this before when you presented it, and it's quite a daunting assembly bill. You stated that if the development's within 0.5 miles of any public transit, that ultimately that low housing calculation for parking can be zero?
It's no parking requirement is what the law
For
says.
only for the 20%.
No, it's for all.
So the entire
That's what the law says.
structure,
Yeah.
regardless of whether it is low income or not.
Yeah, so we are currently navigating through, we have several assembly bills that were adopted in September. We have 2 that go into effect on July 1. So there's always legs to this, so it's not over even after tonight for myself. We are working with SB 6 and AB 2011 to present some options to adopt into our zoning ordinance to make sure there's equity and fairness when it comes to building additional housing units. And one of the things that came up is AB 2097. And basically what the bill says is that it prohibits public agencies from requiring parking for any development projects, and they say residential, commercial, or other, within a half mile of public transit, but they do define what the public transit is. So it's major bus routes with buses coming at least every 15 minutes during peak periods. So we would have to look at our current transportation corridor, public transit corridor, and see if during the peak periods, if it's meeting that criteria in order for it to qualify.
Or a train station.
Train station's automatic, yeah, but usually it's the bus route. You want to see what its frequency levels are.
And so did you imply in the documents that we've already incorporated that AB 2097 standard?
We have not. It's
we have
automatic.
not.
Yeah, it's
Right.
it's in effect today. This is one bill that went into effect.
But
immediately.
our current plan presented before us does not necessarily support that language of AB 2097
No,
yet. Okay.
no, it would be a fallback.
Yeah. I'll do 2 more and then pass to other members. We'll come back. I didn't see anywhere in the document, and there's lots of pages, so I may have missed it. Did we consider a in lieu of option that would allow a developer to, in lieu of open space in their development, provide funding or materials or construction of adjacent or other in lieu of properties? So for example, if they are unable to meet the open space in their development, that they would agree to build a park a mile away or something along those lines. Did we ever consider that in?
So no, we did not for 2 reasons. One is that developments of this nature are still subject to our development impact fees. They are not exempt. So they will pay either the city, well, they're going to pay the city's park improvement fee, because if it's not tied to a residential subdivision, that's when you pay the Quimby fee, which is the in lieu fee of land being dedicated for parks. But what the city did at the same time, knowing this many years ago, well, not every project is a subdivision. So how do we get park improvement fees to the city when we can't collect Quimby? And that's where we came up with the park improvement fee. So I could tell you the park improvement fee and the Quimby fee is identical. So if we're not getting it one way, we're getting it the other. So these projects are still subject to the park improvement fee. And then that goes into our capital improvement project, and then it gets used for citywide park improvements.
But
So
we
they are
haven't
doing-
specifically incorporated in lieu of option.
No, because it's basically, we also don't want to be doing a double dip. So we really want them to have the on-site amenities. An on-site amenity is a plus for development. So that's something that they're going to have to strategize on, a developer is. And again, that's where the rooftop amenity comes in. Other high-density cities such as LA, metropolitan areas, they make it happen. But I think a lot of it is indoor space, really good interior space, fitness centers, other convening places where people can congregate, and rooftop amenities.
I have more questions, but I'll take a break and
I just
pass
wanted to
others.
expand on that since we're already on that. So if they wanted to put balcony, which would, in a way, be a personal open space for each unit, would that give them less open space ratio? Could they, instead of going 4 feet out for a balcony, let's say, or 6, whatever it is, could, instead of being rooftop, expand each of them 8-foot balconies, for example? How
So
does that work?
it's the 50-50 split. So remember, it's 100 square feet per unit, and 50% of the total square footage has to be in private open space, and 50% has to be in the common. So it doesn't say you get, an excess makeup of anywhere else. It just says 25% of the 50% of the common can be indoor space. So we allow them to break it up. So maybe they can only do 25% outdoor, but then they have to do 25% indoor to kind of make up that loss, to have a little bit of flexibility.
I see.
Yeah.
I had a question. Could you explain floor area ratio, the FAR,
Yeah.
for me, please?
Yeah, so it acts similar like a lot coverage. So our general plan relies on FAR, and a lot of studies that we do rely on FAR. And it's really how much of the site you can build based on, so you have a size area. So say you have a 1 acre site and you want to multiply it by the FAR, and it basically tells you how much of a building you can cover with that site. So it's the opposite of lot coverage. So it basically tells you how much coverage you can get on that site based on the FAR. And the FAR doesn't regulate height limitation or anything like that. So it leaves it really flexible for a developer to say, okay, if I have an FAR of 2.0 and I'm working with a 1 acre site, this tells me how much building square footage I can have. Now it's their job to figure out how they're going to make it fit based on the building envelope.
Okay, so keeping that in mind and going to the slide show where you're talking about high-density residential, and then the grid was there for the specs, and the next slide shows the footprints, and then it had the photos. So going back to the footprint, there was the building, the 2 options, left and right, and then in the center, there was gray area. What did the gray area
I
represent?
think it was representing maybe surface area. So landscaping, it could be parking, it could be all of that. So this was an example at 45, yeah. And then this was another example. This looked to be a podium design. It's a ground level podium parking there.
And that was my next question. Could you explain the podium parking?
It's similar to what you see on North Main Street. So you have podium parking. So you drive in underneath and you have everything in the front. And then you can have parking that's right behind the buildings. And then it goes up each level. And then every level has access to that parking space on that garage level.
Okay, thank you. And I had a question. It showed on, when you did, it said page 18, this is 11. It talked about parking and the sidewalk was 5 foot. You were explaining on the lower left-hand side of that photo. And yet the sidewalk itself was 5 foot, but the distance between that and the curb where the cars are, so you have your landscaping and then you have the cars, the curb in the street. So that's not 5 feet, right?
Right, so it's basically the property line starts behind the right-of-way, so the setback occurs from the property line. So it's a 5-foot setback from the property line, which is usually behind sidewalk.
Okay, got it. Because I was going to say, I think in the downtown district, the specific plan, it encouraged this type of setting where you have the cafe and you have outdoor seating adjacent to the retail, that. Okay.
Absolutely.
I
And
couldn't
that
figure
wa-
out how you do that in 5 feet, so.
Yeah, absolutely. And the plan that economic development worked on continued to encourage that, only because it brings in pedestrian, livability, just some excitement to the area rather than seeing a sea of parking or a bunch of setbacks where the building is so far from the street.
I just have a couple questions. Do you have projects slated under this working draft?
No, we do
checklist?
not. We do not. We do have, I have received calls from people that are part of the rezoning program that have become interested. So they will start discussions with us if they are interested in moving forward. And they're fully aware of the affordable housing component.
Would that include the gentleman who spoke at our last meeting?
Yes.
Murray Calendars?
Yes,
I was
he is
wondering.
called again today. So that is a site that was looked at and it was brought in at the last minute, but it's a struggling site and it's in that, high quality transit corridor next to Metrolink, which has some pluses to it.
And if they want to move forward, they would have to complete this whole checklist
Yes.
of 150 plus items.
Yes.
Okay, so this is all hypothetical. It's not. That's the only thing I had. Thank you.
Ms. Coletta, there's a whole section in our report about environmental analysis and the EIR. And I know it stated here that there were no impacts as a result of this.
So
I
let me,
wonder if you could expand a little bit upon that.
So
There
if
has
I
to be
could-
something that, that's of challenge or that, is pushing the limits of that. I'm just kind of curious if you could share any thoughts on that.
So what the language actually says, it says that there are no impacts in addition to those that were already identified in the general plan EIR. So this is a supplemental EIR, which CEQA allows us to do. We did the general plan EIR, and it's still very fresh. It was from 2020, as you know, but we had some significant and unavoidable impacts at that time. So when we did the supplemental EIR, which is more of that program EIR base, it looked at all of those impacts in the general plan EIR, and it was determined that this housing element rezoning program was not going to create impacts that were not already identified. So what we had to do is that we had to do new overrides for the same impacts that we already identified back in 2020. And those were related to, number one, air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, I believe, related to timing of construction. So they were about 5 of them, but very minor. But again, the general plan EIR already covered all of that. And we also have mitigation in our EIR that talks about everything the planner should be looking at. So when it comes to example, looking at air quality, we still have to follow Rule 103 and all of that stuff for dust and emissions during construction. With all of the guidelines in California, construction equipment is already compliant based on the equipment it uses, the gas it uses, and everything.
Yeah, Tierney, you touched on a train of thought that I made some notes on, and I think back of what the commission has heard over the years on previous projects, and I was kind of going down a list of things that we've either discussed or potentially asked for or changed in a condition of approval. Most of them, it seems like we've captured in the development plan. I noticed a few things. One would be operational practices, maintenance, CFDs, how a project is maintained. I'm curious if I missed that or if CFDs are part of the development plan.
So normally on your multifamily, those are all managed. Everything on site is managed by the management company. It's not necessarily an HOA when you have multifamily. It's the management company that maintains that. However, CFD annexation for general purpose is still applicable. So we have our public service CFD and we also have our landscape maintenance CFD, and those are citywide. So everybody in general is a population that participates in that. But normally in multifamily, the management company 100% is responsible for all of their on-site maintenance.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, one other thought I just wanted to flesh out. The one part of this that I kind of, either I don't understand or just better clarity. On one hand, we have SB 35 that says there can be no subjectivity to the approval process. But then within the documents, we even state, we use words such as when possible, if possible, where possible. And I'm just wondering how we keep city staff from being caught in that subjective realm versus here it is. I either have it included in my development plan as an applicant, and it's very clear and I can check it off, or maybe it's gray or the developer's trying to finagle things. I brought up the in lieu of because I've dealt with that in my past. And I'm just curious how we keep staff in the city.
Do you have an
From being
example of
subjective.
what you read on one of those? Most of them should have been that they are required, but there were some comments made that to the extent feasible.
Yeah, so like site circulation and access uses where possible. Setback, there's a mention of where possible. So that's a few examples. But then second to that is part of, I know we're being challenged by the state laws that are driving this, but part of the process we had before us was the ability for at least the public to hear that applications were being reviewed, that their concerns were able to be expressed, and at times the commission was able to make amendments or changes to the application to do that. And I understand that that ability is going to be severely limited, but as such, is there some vehicle or way that the public can see that staff, I envision 3 years from now when we have all these developments that have been approved under these new guidelines, that staff actually has gone through the checklist and that there truly were no subjective approvals and that indeed all 150 plus were checked yes.
Are you asking if this is going to be made public, the checklist?
Yeah, I'm kind of
or-
curious what the oversight and visibility and transparency would be on these projects going forward, since they're not necessarily as open approved as they are today.
Yeah. So everything that we take in is a public record. So our development plan review is public information. We do post our agendas, and they are posted on our website. And people commonly go to that website just to see what's up and coming. So if they see something on the agenda, they may contact the city and say, hey, I saw this. I want to take a look at it. All of that information remains available to the public. So our agendas are up there, and anybody that wants to come in and view the file, that will also be made available to them. Absolutely. Anytime we issue a building permit, our plans are now scanned. We have a whole new online submittal, so the plans are always in a permanent nature. So even building plans are available to the public.
So for the meeting and the agendas are posted and John Doe goes up and asks for the file, what's in the file?
So the file contains the application material and the drawings. It contains the project proposal.
But not meeting minutes or, hey, you need to comply with ABC.
It comes
type thing.
afterwards. So we do provide a comment letter to the applicant, and it is documented and also put in that file.
So when we get a staff report on projects coming before us and it documents the process and perhaps staff determined that the application was incomplete, those items are listed in that file?
Absolutely.
I see.
They're all in that file. They're all retained with the project because we are subject to the Public Records Act. So it's basically keeping that information where it needs to be.
I had a question on your checklist. I believe you said that one that you put together was with the objective standards. And it differs than the ones last year, for example, that would use through a regular internal planner checklist, for example. So this is the new and improved robust one.
So this is only for the properties that are within the affordable housing overlay zone. So please remember that. So if you have another residential project that is not part of the AHO zone, those are still subject to its regular process and their development standards. So if it's in a specific plan, it's a single family, it's an R3, it's subject to those standards. This is strictly for the affordable housing overlay zone because it makes accommodation for the affordable housing units.
And we'll know that because we won't see it. Anything that we see is going to be outside the AHO,
Well, if there's any.
unless there's a variance or CUP or something. like
Correct,
that.
correct.
I see. All right, thank you, that answers.
Or
my
if there's an affordable housing project that goes up in the city that is not in the affordable housing overlay zone, that happens as well. So if you have, our housing authority is working on a piece of property in the city, if it's not an AHO zone, then that's still subject to discretionary review.
It's good to remind us. I had a question. It was on page 4. It talked about all development applications in the rezone program must adhere to the, I'll just say ODS and Design Guide DG. However, the sites located within a specific plan shall refer to the specific plan design guidelines. But if the specific plan is silent, then the report would be the would govern it. Is there an example of what that would be, or do you have one in mind of what specific plan would be silent on? Would it have to be the whole list of guidelines, for example, that we reviewed for this meeting, or?
So it depends. So we have some specific plans that have design guidelines like North Main and downtown. They have a specific set of design guidelines with respect to architecture, articulation, facade, all of that. But you may have a specific plan, and I don't know of one off the top of my head, that may just not have design guidelines. It just has development standards. Then these would apply if it's in the AHO zone. Remember, most of these are in the C3, and then most of them are on North Main. So you're really working with the C3 zone, which are going to be these new guidelines, and then the North Main design guidelines will apply to North Main.
So for example, if one of them had been within the circle, which is the
Downtown.
specific plan, and it talked about all kinds of things, but mixed land uses, and it talked about, for example, transportation systems, specifically under 5. It talked about what those would look like, examples of what those parking structures would look like. It would adhere to the exterior aesthetics of the surrounding residential also, or?
It's a surrounding area. So you have commercial standards that are in place, and then you have infill residential standards. So you're going to fall back on what the specific plan is requiring for that particular zoning. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, and you know where I'm going because we talked about this last week. Historic district within the circle, which contains inventory houses, which are not on the registry yet, but they are rated and they are eligible for the Mills Act if the owner decides to move forward for that tax break. So when I open up the specific plan for downtown, it talks about new infill residential structures, and the most important issue, and this is reading, the single most important issue of new infill residential development is one of compatibility, excuse me, especially when considering larger residences. When the new residential structure are developed adjacent to an older family residence, whether it's historic or otherwise, there are concerns that the height and the bulk of the infill residences will have a negative impact to the adjacent smaller scale buildings. The following considerations are intended to address. So the new development should continue the functional on-site relationship with the surrounding neighborhood. Patterns that should be continued are front porches, entry-facing streets, garages, etc. And it goes on to talk about the yard setbacks for the new residential infill, so it matches the existing setback of the patterns of the surrounding properties. New infill structures should incorporate the traditional architecture characteristics of existing residences, which could be historical, found in surrounding neighborhoods, windows, door spacing, exterior, et cetera, et cetera. And then letter E is the proper use of building materials to enhance the desired neighborhood qualities such as compatibility, continuity, harmony, et cetera. Then it jumps down saying the height of the new residential structure should be considered within the context of the surrounding structures. So basically what it's saying is any infill in the circle should adhere to, for example, my point being, if we have 3 or 4 houses that are part of the inventory, or they're been deemed historically significant in architecture, et cetera. Then the new infill, if they're part of the overlay, should, by this standard, the AHO will not take over. This would take precedence because it's not silent, correct?
Yes, and I do want to clarify, we do not have any AHO in those areas of town. That was a comment that came out even when we were doing the housing element, that was asked by the city council. So, and then the properties that we did show on Main and Victoria got removed, which were just on the outskirts. So nothing in those lower density single family neighborhoods have been identified as an affordable housing overlay zone.
And is that because, I forgot the street name, Barth and Ford were removed?
No, Barth and Forth were not part of the AHO. They were just being upzoned to a medium density. So they were not affordable housing. It was just allowing them to get additional units from a low to a medium, which is like a duplex.
Right. And so even if a duplex is in there, though, let's say a duplex, in fact, the
On an
architectural
infill,
drawing
if
here,
it was, yeah.
it should be
Oh, yes.
compatible to those that are
With the
around them.
specific plant.
With the
yes.
specific plant.
Yes.
Okay, so my point being is the historical characteristics of the circle could be, the integrity of those characteristics could be protected and preserved.
Yes.
Within the theme of the, okay. And that would apply to Grand Boulevard Circle too. Here under the specific plan, under 7 Streetscape Plan, Grand Boulevard Circle, most recognizable urban design feature. Much of the urban development along the circle is low-density residential. The streets concept is quite simple and elegant. Talks about the trees and the lighting standards. So all of that is to enhance and preserve the architectural elements.
Yes, and Grand does have affordable housing units. We built those about 20 years ago. Not we, but with the developer back in the day. But it's over there off of Grand and 2nd Street, right across from City Hall. Those are all affordable housing units that were built about 20 years ago. And they face Grand. And they did like a Spanish Mediterranean style. So you do see multifamily. There's quite several. If you ever drive through the circle, back when I was an intern and having to do inventory, there are things in there that look like they were old motels that were converted. It's quite interesting and mixed in with that, neighborhood environment. So there's a lot of unique things you find.
And I do remember we did have that come before us as far as the new owner and wanting to make enhancements to the spaces and the common areas for that. I believe that was senior living outside of the circle, but okay, I'll stop for now.
And I just want to confirm, Joanne, if we do get these projects coming in, they would go through the Planning and Housing Commission, right, for approval, or is that just?
No, the discretionary approval. Yeah, the discretionary approval, the state law is so it's like redundant, but yeah, so that's why.
But only if it's an AHO. If it's a standard development, then it still would follow.
Yes, that's correct. Right. So this is only, again, for the affordable housing overlay zone properties, which is where we're trying to achieve the 2,800 low-income housing units that we were given in the RENA allocation.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Collette, at our last meeting, we had tremendous public comment, and I would bucket it into about 3 categories, all of which in some way, shape, or form are part of your presentation. But I'm wondering if you could just take a minute to maybe just highlight some of the major concerns, except for parking. Parking is at a point where we really have no control over what's going to happen with parking. And I know I'm not discounting that as a concern. It was voiced by almost everybody. But it is an area that we have little ability to impact. But we do have the ability through this to impact. There were a lot of comments about existing streets and improvements that happened to the streets, landscaping. We had feedback about, cars, lots of cars driving down the street, what was going to happen with street width, all of those things, as well as, I know parks was brought up and just the general look and feel of the streets. And I know that's part of what we've discussed tonight. I'm just curious if you could maybe highlight some things that are different or better in this new DPR that might address those concerns.
So I wouldn't say that they're different. Anytime you're dealing with new construction, our municipal code already gives the city authority to require the developer to construct any missing public improvements. They are also required to upgrade any facilities that may be deficient. So whether that's utilities or water lines, those can get upgraded as well. But if you have a piece of property that is adjacent to the public right-of-way and maybe it's substandard because it hasn't been improved, the developer is responsible for doing that. Additionally, if it's part of a larger project, because maybe piecemealing it is not a good idea because maybe you would have a piece of property that will look different because it's infill from adjacent properties, that they would have to pay a fair share. And over time, the city would come in and do that as a capital improvement project, so the improvement can be done all at one time. None of that goes away, even though it's non-discretionary. The municipal code still gives us the authority to require those improvements. So those still happen today. You don't see every project that comes before you for new construction because it's not subject to discretionary review, but we are still requiring those improvements.
Is there maybe an example that comes to mind? I don't know, about a street width that's a concern, or?
So we always look at what the general plan is. If right-of-way dedication is not already there, then they have to dedicate that right-of-way. We have to make sure that we get that right-of-way dedication. So let's just say 6th Street requires 106-foot right-of-way and it's only 100 feet, and so they got to get 3 feet of additional right-of-way on each side. We will make sure every time we go in there, we got to get that additional 3 feet from each property owner. So those are the examples. So the dedication is still going to be required with new construction.
It may not happen at that specific time of the development,
Yeah.
not until multiple developments have occurred.
Yeah, it all depends. Some public improvements, you could definitely get them right at the time of new construction. Some may be tied as more of a comprehensive project, so you have to wait to get that done. So you just don't have, inconsistencies.
And public safety and security was one that came up quite a bit. And I don't recall, is this a new requirement in the DPR of everything related to closed circuit security cameras and the distances and all of that? Is that enhanced from what our current standard is?
It could be.
It seems like there's more here than.
There is. This was something that we definitely, because you're having more of an urban environment, we want to make sure that that safety component is in there. So absolutely. And that's something we're going to be requiring of them.
Yeah, and that was one of the items in previous reviews that have come before the commission where we've talked about security cameras. We've asked developers and owners to enhance their systems. And it seemed to me that there's quite a few more requirements outlined here.
Or for the gym, I know we talked about putting the gates, so access to the back area, the landscaping in the back wouldn't be as tall, so it wouldn't encourage encampment type of activity.
Yeah, and you never know with parking structures, if they're going to have a key card, access, that's another way of securing that as well.
Well, I remember that one developer said absolutely, he'd put the camera system in. And that goes to my comment that I had written down here about the dumpster enclosures. I know it was, over the years, that's been my baby, but, really proud of the Raising Cane dumpster standard. And I'd like to see that put in here versus just the picture that Sandtech had put in your PowerPoint. Not picking on you, Adam. It's my thing. And then the CPTED, the crime prevention through environmental design, that all plays a part, and you addressed it in your slide about the lighting and the easement and the access to the building, well lit, and it was glass, at least in the example, it was glass, so you could see what was beyond it, that sort of thing. I don't know how to, your slideshow wasn't the same as we saw as our attachment, so I don't know how to address these because I wrote down the page numbers. But for example, on page 12 of this one, it talked about the 60-foot height and the 80-foot height. I had concerned here about the exterior building facades. and what that would look like. I think my main thing, and I talked to you before the meeting about when I saw pictures of this and I saw long lengths of flat building without any articulation in some of Stantec's examples. For example, right there, the Andy Apartments. When you look at the footprint here, and it talks about the, I don't know what you call them, the little offset, the setting in, the depression there of the building. I just don't know that, see, when you look up above and you see Metro, that's more like a 4-foot depression, or it stands out away from the face of the building. I think that's more interesting. I think only 2 feet, which is probably more that's depicted here in the floor plan. I think that just gives more of the same, and sometimes it's just a color change. The middle picture there is not attractive in my opinion. It's just a long, flat building. It looks like those old warehouse buildings versus something that has more interesting character, the building, and it has, for example, the Metro at Maine, it's got the difference of the tower and the roof line height, and it's got the, not just the color, but the features that stand out more, all the way from the first floor all the way up to the top floor. Whereas, don't get me started on the George, I never want to see that built in Corona. Just my personal opinion. Can you keep going through? 3-year slides, please.
Which way am I going? Am I
You're going
this
forward here. That family subdivision in the top one, I think that is very boxy. I don't think it fits in our city. Just to note, Stantec, I know you're just throwing examples out there, but that one, I don't think it fits any area in Corona. I like the Union Square there, that one. It also reminds me of the Metro, where it has the deviation with the roof line height. It's got the supports to the roof line. It's got the patio cover on the first floor. All of those details that add to the character of the building versus just a straight flat building, which is depicted in this footprint here, which I don't think. So my point is, if the grid of those for the 45 dwelling units per acre, if the grid part translates to this footprint and translate in any way to the top picture, for example, then that needs to change, because that, in my opinion, doesn't fit in the city. And could we go to the next slide, please? Where there's pictures. Okay, let's see here. In my opinion, the one in the upper right, it does have the deviations, it does have the porch, but to me, it's some kind of a lazy attempt at changing up the face of that building. There's just not enough features to it, and I don't think it would fit for a 5-story, 6-story residential over mixed-use retail. The center picture, is that in our city? Is that Artisan? I don't have my,
Yes.
okay, Artisan. So
Seems
that's
like most of the modern ones are the ones you're,
that I'm focusing
out,
on,
yeah.
that are good looking and they fit because they already fit in with Metro at Maine, and the Artisan is complementary to that. The bottom right one, I love how it brings in landscaping and the porches, and it breaks it up between brick and glass. Please, next slide.
That's example of parking.
It goes to my point if you go back.
Oh, sorry.
To see how it's all one dimension except for maybe a foot, or how they offset every other one.
Yeah.
And then the building in the background, forget the height, but that kind of look where it's the same repetitive windows, I just don't think it's attractive.
Yeah, and I think that was a parking garage design there, but absolutely. And then the top one that you see there, that's actually here in the city off of Metro. That's the one that sits across from Ganal Lumber. And as you can see, the parking is tucked in the back there. And what you see along Main and Harrison is the front of the building.
Yeah, because the parking, you wouldn't even, unless you went back there, you wouldn't know.
Yeah, so they
And-
picked
the point
the,
is the photo examples don't really necessarily reflect, since this is just
The
parking,
footprint, right?
the building above the parking example doesn't reflect our standard.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I just wanted, I don't need to go through all the photos, but you get the idea. Some of the things that were in the slide show the abstract, the corrugated siding, I don't know what you even call that. Could I ask a question? What is the build down in Dos Lagos, the one next to the 15, that's so odd looking and doesn't fit in with the surrounding?
The
Toronto?
No, is it the live work units?
I don't think so.
Oh, Toronto. Yeah. So, that is, that was more of a, that was a modern design. So across the street, the same developer did more of a, subtle Mediterranean design, and then he had a different design on the other side.
I've
So,
had a word with that developer about that. The painting improved it, but that should be the last time that happens in our city. So my point is that the exterior, the aesthetics is important. That I believe the city, bless you, the city has gone with Tuscan and
Spanish, craftsman, and modern.
and modern. And I think the Craftsman and the Spanish, and maybe even Tuscan, I don't know of example of a Tuscan.
I would say the artisan may be modern
Okay.
Tuscan.
Yeah, something like that. But
Bedford's all,
Yeah, Bedford's
Bedford is Tuscan.
and farmhouse.
is.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I think that is more the running theme, and it stands out to us when we get calls, at least I did, for example, where a business paints their outside yellow instead of not being in the plan, and they corrected it, thankfully. But something like that it's so odd that it doesn't fit in with the surrounding area, of course, is something we want to be aware of as we move forward. I'm not sure that a modern house, for example, in the circle, if it is in vicinity of historic homes, whether it be one or two away, it should be, and I don't know what that mechanism is, if you could help me through that. And it's another level, I know you said it's being discussed with economic development moving forward, with keeping the character of the historic within the circle, so there isn't that drastic next to each other. I know you heard my complaints about all of you did, the modern charging station right next to Chuckwagon, and the drastic, comparison. And I just don't think it has a good flow, and it takes away from the historic homes that have been put on the inventory in the registry. How does that work?
Well, in respect to this project, it's not there. In respect to this rezoning program, that's not changing. So that requirement that you spoke of earlier is still in place. Again, we focus these along the commercial corridors, so it's not going to affect, the infill nature of those homes that are mostly on the south side of 6th Street, and they extend to the southwest of Grand Avenue as well.
Okay, I know that we have spoken many times about the integrity of the neighborhood and being a good neighbor, right? And we even had discussion on the one home that was renovated outside of the architecture of historic allowances. And
So where does that come in? Maybe you could share with us the process. If it is somewhat subjective, we're allowed to check something off. If an applicant came to us in a neighborhood that was Tuscan and wanted to build a ultra-modern 60% glazed AHO unit, do we still have the ability to suggest and ask that they reconsider? It's still within the 4 building types,
So
that you're out of place and that we
well,
don't want to
Well,
see a
I
modern
think if
facade.
I can answer that, when you drive on 6th Street, it's not consistent architecture. It's various. And unless the city is going to adopt one type of architecture that it's only going to use, that's going to be nearly impossible. And when it comes to neighborhoods, variety is okay. A lot of post-war homes were not cookie cutter developments that you see today with subdivisions, and there's 4 different floor plans and models, and they're just repetitive and they change up the color and material. There's houses that were custom built on each home, on each lot, and they just have a variety of architecture, and it's still pleasing. So on 6th Street, you don't have a set standard. So you're probably going to see some, differences. It's a matter of, making sure that the quality is there. So it's a tough one. I mean, we don't have one particular architecture unless you're in a specific plan that says, like Bedford, you're using these 3 types of architecture and that's all you're using. And that's because it's a master plan community and it's contained. But the city does not have one type of architecture that it's going to be used repetitively on every property.
I remember when economic development put together their plan for downtown, and there was a specific slide that had a image superimposed without, for an infill between 2 businesses on 6th Street. And then what they were proposing was beautiful. It was still respected a historical look. It had some modern twinges to it in color and metal and, the variety of the textures, that sort of thing. So having moved forward, that would be what should be respected. I mean, and maybe the questions are coming from a standpoint of staff sitting behind a desk and checking off this list and not driving out and seeing, the neighboring,
Absolutely.
You know what I'm saying?
No, and that is something we have talked about with staff actually pretty recently. You can't do behind your desk planning. You have to get out and look at the environment. You have to look at the scale of the street. You have to look, and it allows you to make better suggestions. So absolutely, there should be field visits to understand the environment 100%.
Glad to hear it. Thank you.
Any other questions? We can go to public comment and then come back if you wish. Okay. Ms. Coletta, what we'll do now, let's go ahead and open public comment. And Ms. Capia, I was just going to ask you if we received any speaker cards or comments, and we have. So thank you for bringing that up. We have Mr. Joe Morgan opening public comment.
I guess I'm just about the public that's here. I feel kind of lonely after the last meeting. So I feel like it's so empty in here. Just a little but linguistic kind of a point. I'm always curious to hear Corona described as being urban, which, I've always thought of urban as more of a Los Angeles kind of a thing. And, we're clearly not Los Angeles, and I'm just not really I'm not really understanding the language. Is it everywhere that doesn't have tractors urban at this point? Or, is that really the dividing line, is the John Deere per capita thing? Or, just everywhere where there's paved roads? Some of this I feel a little bit confused about. I've watched it all along, and I'm curious if there's things that's actually changed in these design guidelines, or is this just codifying our existing guidelines? Are we just having to write it down now because of the new state guidelines? Were these things that we already had in place? Have there been significant changes in this aside from the parking? Are these all things that we already required that we just have to, set in an objective form? When I had to write IEPs, there was things that you do every day, but when you have to write down the things that you're going to do, it just makes it legal language, even though that's what you did anyway. And somebody asked this question the last time, and or maybe I asked it, I forget, but I know it came up, and I never really understood if it was greater, equal to, or less than. Is the blocking and the density greater, equal to, or less than Metro? The proposed blocking for the 60 units, are we going to have? Yeah, because I just have to try to understand it in terms of things that I've seen before. Are we going to have developments more massive than Metro? I'm not a fan of Metro. I don't think it fits with the rest of the city, but I guess now it does because it's here. So, is it going to be now something that's going to push the envelope even further, or are we going to live within the existing envelope of Metro? to my mind, we've never rejected or excessively penalized or, penciled to death any affordable housing project that it can. I mean, I'm curious if any of them have ever been, proposed that we're like, yeah, that's not going to work here. It seems like we've been pretty open to anybody who's brought any sort of affordable project before. I don't know that it seems like these laws are made for other places that are a lot less amenable than we are. And so I'm just trying to wrap my head around this. I did find an answer to one question that was like, what percentage of units? It was 20%, 20% of the units. So I guess that's all that I have. And just one small question about the AHO. I'm curious why we didn't, so we have a thing potentially going in, we're working on having something going here, Second Street and Buena Vista. That's not part of the AHO. Sometimes I really want to figure out exactly what is going on here. So anyway.
Yeah, that one we're rezoning to R3, so it's fitting within the R3 development standards. It's not going to get any denser to where it needs to push to 45. It's staying somewhere around 36 DUs to the acre on that one.
Okay.
And I can answer if you wanted me
Sure,
to.
did we have any other public comment? No. Yeah, actually, so because several of the slides that you presented, I think, Mr. Morgan, some of the slides would clarify that.
So
What's different between the
there
two?
are some different standards, yes. The setback criteria is different than what we have. So what we did, we used our examples that we already had to come up with these. So they are a little bit different, a little bit more lenient because we don't know how much land area we're going to be working with when this all comes about. The intent is to do lot consolidation so you can get some usable parcels in there. That's why some of those AHO zones are next to one another to see if you have somebody that comes in, maybe they can consolidate 3 parcels, which is always the intent. It's exactly what happened on North Main. All of those parcels were part of a shopping center, different ownership, and they bought them and consolidated them to make that project. So these are, yes, different standards than what we have today. So hopefully we provide that example. And Mr. Morgan is right. We've always been a good steward of affordable housing. But unfortunately, the way it's being viewed at the state level, other cities that have not been a good steward have resulted in this. So even the cities that have been good stewards are now having to be penalized by some of these decisions. And you're right. We've always worked very closely with our housing authority on bringing those projects to fruition.
And of the public comment about an example, North Main was one of the criteria that was used in the development. Is that the largest example?
So that is a 60 dwelling units to the acre. Our urban density designation goes up to 60 and the mixed use goes to the FAR, which is 2.0. Mixed use is because you're making accommodations for the commercial on the ground floor, but the 100% residential falls under the urban density. And so that is allowed up to 60 dwelling units to the acre.
And what is the medium density?
Medium density is up to 15 dwelling units to the acre. High density is up to 36 dwelling units
High
to the
density,
acre.
thank you. So in a recent example of high density for us?
North Main did meet the 60 dwelling units to the acre.
60. but
High
I don't think-
density would be like what you're seeing in Dos Lagos. Those apartments are considered
Okay,
high
right.
density. What you see on McKinley, those are high density. The corners of McKinley and Promenade, those are high
35,
density.
yeah. So the largest density we would have under our new development plan would be exampled by North Main.
Yes, that was the pilot project.
All right, bring it back. Any further comments by commission? None for me. I've commented and questioned. With that, do we have a motion for our item? It doesn't have a number, that's why I was looking for the number. Consideration of the high-density residential and mixed-use objective development standards and design guidelines.
I'll go ahead and make a motion to recommend to council the high-density residential and mixed-use objective standard, development standards and design guidelines.
I second the motion.
And we have a second by Commissioner Meza. Commission, please vote. And the motion passes. I think we need to create an acronym for that, Ms. Coletta. All right, we'll move in our agenda for written comments. Ms. Capilla, has the Planning and Housing Commission received any written communication from persons providing or seeking action by the Planning and Housing Commission?
No, we did not.
Thank you. Ms. Coletta, you've been with us a lot tonight and last week. Any administrative reports further from those?
No, we will continue through this journey, and I will keep you posted. We do have, in April, we're looking to go to the Committee of the Whole to talk about Senate Bill 6 and AB 2011. So I'll just remind you in case you want to tune in and listen to that. We have to really get something in our books before July 1. And that's just another avenue. So it just seems to keep getting more compounded as we move on. And I hate to tell you this, I don't think it's going to stop. So I think this is going to be an ongoing issue for the next couple of years.
Thank you. Fellow commissioners, any reports or comments to share tonight?
I just wanted to say, not related to this agenda item, because Ms. Coletta said there were no AHO designation within the historic district. But with economic development, putting together a plan for the circle and the historic, to expand, including the historic district. I don't know, I spoke to Richard Wynn today regarding, because I was wondering if Adam or Stantec had reached out to them, but realizing now that AHO is outside of the circle. The intent would be for this body to perhaps be interested in weighing in on that process, and perhaps the things that I talked about regarding infills next to historic homes that are either on the registry or on the inventory, and to ensure that we would also like to emphasize and recommend that consideration be given to infills when it affects next door to a historic home, and not to have that disparate structure and architecture that collides and causes conflict with being a good neighbor and having that consistency. There's a reason why the district is historic, and it's in our city motto, and I'd just be curious if there was any interest in putting a letter forward to the process.
I'm amenable to that. I mean, we will have before the commission a list of future approvals of AHO overlay zones. And certainly part of that could be understanding their impact.
Well, I think if I understand Commissioner Alexander, so Jay, if you can, we could give you the update on what's going on with the downtown revitalization plan. They say the same thing, but we do have a specific plan, which is your governing document, and then we do have a separate plan that was approved by the Council for Economic Development, but it's not really a regulatory document. But we are working to kind of meld the two, and there is a process involved in that will come before this commission if there's any changes to the specific plan. Do you have you want to give a status update on what's going on with that?
Yeah, I don't have a particular date, but there are, as Joanne mentioned, there's a standard that was prepared by Storyland and their consultants, and then the city has the adopted standards. So we're working to put together an RFP for a firm to come in and compare the two and look at revisions to meld them together, because in some cases they're consistent with each other, maybe slight word changes, or some things are illustrated but not necessarily verbalized in the new document. And we do have language here that needs to be melded. So we're looking at putting together an RFP for a consultant to come in and blend those together. So I don't have a timeline on that because I'm working on that or trying to get to work on the details of that, and it's an item that I'm behind on.
But that will be, and there will be a public process. So I'm assuming, given the amount of comments that came out when that was being presented at that time and some of the comments that the council had received, I do think when you're looking at those standards and whatever they may be, that should be part of the process.
I appreciate it. Thank you both. Thank you.
All right, with that, we'll adjourn tonight's meeting. Our next scheduled meeting is February 21st, and we'll be addressing the continued items from this evening in that meeting. Yeah. Thank you. Good night.